Hello and welcome to week 4 of Environmental Health Issues. My name is Glenn Verinder and I'm going to be providing you with an introductory lecture on air quality and pollution, which is the first of the challenges that we're going to be proposing to you this semester. And I'm going to share my screen with you so that hopefully you'll be able to follow me as we go along. That looks good, and see me at the same time. With each of these topics, we would like you to keep in mind the first 3 weeks of the subject about sustainability and the principles of social and environmental justice in particular, and the other principles such as intergenerational equity and the precautionary principle, and the importance of monitoring the state of the environment, and also the importance of community participation in decision making about sustainability. Air quality and pollution is a very large subject, and so this presentation is merely an introduction. There are many resources for you on LMS though. And one of the first that you'll see is there's a book available in the library by epidemiologist Robert Friss, which is a really great introduction, gives you great background reading to air pollution and the sorts of understandings that you'll need to have for your future discussions. It's also really important for you to understand that all of these areas that we're going to be covering over the next few weeks are inextricably linked. So if we're talking about air pollution, we're also talking about, of course, water pollution, soil pollution, and so on. So we're going to talk about some key points, what is air quality, air pollution, what contributes to it, what the health impacts are, or some of those are, and who the vulnerable groups are, as we will with each of the topics. So as Yassi says, it's essentially, you can read this definition, but really the natural processes cannot keep up with converting or depositing or diluting contaminants. The contaminants can be indoor air pollution or outdoor air pollution, and they can be from many sources, so it might be chemical or physical, biological. One of those agents modifies the natural characteristics, in this case, of air or the atmosphere. And the causes can be many. Simple things such as stoves, motor vehicles, industrial facilities, natural phenomena such as fires, and so on. And the health impacts are many. We commonly think about respiratory diseases, but of course there are others which can be fatal. And there are some great images of air pollution, well, sadly, on Google, and Friss, when you're reading the chapter from Robert Friss, takes a notice of some of the examples that he provides, but of course there are many others. And we'll come back to pollution later on in the semester, in particular when we're talking about government policies to prevent pollution and some of the spectacular events throughout the world and indeed in Australia. So you don't have to remember really when we're talking about the categories of pollutants, you don't have to remember all of the examples, but you do have to remember what the major categories are. And so the first one there that we have criteria pollutants, and these are usually the ones that we use to indicate, they're indicators of air quality, and they are a major public health concern and includes particulate matter, carbon monoxide, ozone, nitrogen dioxide and sulfur dioxide are some of the examples there. Particulate matter in particular, which I will talk about again shortly. Air toxics such as lead are often at low levels, but can have significant impacts on health. Lead, for example, has significant impacts on children's neurological health, and some of you will be familiar with examples where lead mining occurs, such as in Broken Hill in New South Wales. And then, of course, there are biological pollutants, and these are produced by living things, and as you see, are absolutely everywhere. So the deaths, this is information from the World Health Organization, says that in 2012 there were an estimated 7 million, well, more than that. And this finding more than doubles previous estimates. And it confirms that air pollution is now a world largest environmental health risk. And there's strong data that reveals the link between both indoor and outdoor pollution, and those exposures resulting in cardiovascular disease such as strokes and heart disease, as well as respiratory diseases and cancers. And that's in addition to air pollution's role, as I say, to respiratory diseases. So the burden of disease, of this sort of disease, is not shared equally. The World Health Organization suggests that 6 million of those 7 million deaths were in low to middle income countries in Southeast Asia and Western Pacific region in particular. So you can see here with the little coloured dots that this is exposure to particulate matter that I talked about previously, and that this refers to the size of the particles. And the smaller the particle, the easier it is to be inhaled deep into the lungs, and therein lies a problem. You can see the table on the left. The green dots in countries such as Australia and New Zealand means less exposure, and the red dots and the purple dots mean greater exposure. And the World Health Organization, if you're looking for more resources on this, provides some really good data. Exposure is also influenced by geography and climate effect. You know, it affects the likelihood of inhalation of particulate matter, but also poverty has a bearing on particulate matter because of the problems of course, inadequate housing, indoor fires, cooking facilities, and so on. And the other thing that matters, of course, is the strength or otherwise of policies to reduce the likelihood of exposure. One of the areas that are also talked about is the carbon dioxide emissions, and I've put up here just for you to see the differences. This is per capita emissions 2015. This information comes from the Union of Concerned Scientists, but there's a great deal of information from, for example, organisations such as the World Bank, World Health Organization. There's a lot of discussion about this, which is why I've put it up. So you can see here per capita, and I am happy to say that I looked at these stats a couple of years ago, and they have gone down slightly, which just might mean that some of the policies that are being put in place are having a slight effect already. As I say, air pollution and its cause is a great concern, and in many countries, and China, for example, does receive a lot of criticism, justifiably, because there's a great deal of pollution, and this image here is a picture from NASA. But the Chinese governments have said that they are strongly committed to improving this situation. You can see here that Australia is not faring too well in terms of per capita emissions. Overall, our contribution is small by comparison to countries such as China, but per capita it's not good. And given that we are connected to the rest of the planet, there's work to be done. and meaning we need to have strong policies around reducing CO2 emissions. So measuring air quality happens at various levels. Australia has quite good facilities, quite a good system in place. And the air quality index is used to show levels of pollution for a range or a subset of pollutants set out by the national environmental protection agencies or ambient air quality areas. And various agencies are responsible in different states. In Victoria, it's the Environmental Protection Authority, for example. And this air quality, highest air quality index is reported in various locations and relates to the level of observed level of pollutants in certain areas, and it's expressed as a percentage. And you can see now that we have really great real-time data, so you can see real-time data at various locations, and they're across the state. I just happened to pick Melbourne at the moment, this data was captured on the 18th of January, and I'm sitting here giving you this lecture and doing the resources for this lecture. And there's also, as you can see at the bottom there, the forecast for the next few days. This is a particularly good set of or good resource for people, particularly with health problems such as asthma and so on. Of course, not everyone has access to computers and servers and NBN and so on. However, it is a good one for health professionals who can check in their health agencies what the situation is going to be. And of course, after the 9 deaths in Melbourne last year from an event, this is some important information. Air pollution in Australia, and the good news, it's relatively good air quality, and because we have a small population and a very large landmass and quite a good wind flows. The bad news that we have, there's an estimated 3,000 deaths per annum from various causes. It contributes to climate change. It being all the various pollutants can contribute to climate change. And really, we could ask the question, are we outsourcing our pollution? So we could say, that the engine for our economic growth that's running in Australia is, we have an exhaust pipe in other countries. So the air pollution in China comes from the coal that we sell from Australia, for example. So the goods that we buy from countries with high emissions may well be contributed to by countries such as Australia selling coal, which is why things are so controversial. These things are quite controversial. These are some of the major deaths from long-term exposure to air pollution. There are a great many resources. This just is some data that Steve Begg and co produced in 2011. Some of you will know Steve, who's a lecturer here at La Trobe and on the Bendigo campus. 2/3 of these deaths were attributable to long-term exposure to air pollutants. And some of the vulnerable groups, of course, were the elderly, what they talk about in their report. So vehicle emissions, major problem. These stats are from 2 years ago, but there are many sources of air pollution, as we know. Motor vehicles are the most pervasive, though, because they have a large impact on urban air quality and human health. Although the combined emissions from industry and electricity generation and wood heating and so on, they're a larger source of particulate matter than motor vehicles because of the presence of so many vehicles. This is a problem. And the other thing we need to remember is that discharges from major industrial power generation facilities are elevated, so they're further up, rather than motor vehicles that we're breathing up close and personal. Very fine particles form a major part of vehicle emissions as well. So all in all, there are major problems, and the Australian Bureau of Transport and Regional Economics is also another source of information where you may find the problems associated with health. The concern about vehicles is growing, and hence the concentration and conversation and policy development around public transport. I think this is a great slide. It shows how you can move people around the city and what that actually means in terms of vehicle emissions. A great many people, of course, on bikes the same amount of people on bikes don't move people around the city and don't have the same health implications, or poor health implications, I should say, as buses or cars. Just put up, power generation, of course, is very important, but it is a matter of how you do it. And the resources on LMS will tell you that people living near power stations in Gippsland are 7 times more likely to die from heart disease than others. And we talked about in week 3 environmental justice, and the point was made then that people close to industrial processes have worse health than those who don't. And there's been a great deal of information, and there is on LMS, around the Hazelwood power station, which is a brown coal power station, and it provided a great deal of baseload electricity at one stage, but there's an enormous fire and as I've said, a great many health problems associated with that power station, and I invite you to have a read of some of that information about Hazelwood and power generation and coal. There is a great deal of information around this and other areas where coal is where the power is generated. So indoor air pollution is a problem, and globally you can see there that 3 billion people cook and heat their homes using open fires, and they're often poorly flued. Many people die prematurely. Many of those are children, and a lot of that is around respiratory disease, but not only respiratory disease. The World Health Organization data talks about pneumonia, chronic obstructive pulmonary disease, lung cancer, and so on. But there's also a relationship or links between indoor air pollution and low birth weight babies, ischemic heart disease, nasopharyngeal cancer, laryngeal cancers, and even things such as TB, where poverty will be part of this story. Women, as you can imagine, bear an unequal burden of this impact due to their roles of cooking, particularly with house fires and so on. In Australia, not such a problem as it is worldwide, but remember that most Australians spend, believe it or not, 90% of their time indoors, and the quality of the indoor air may impact on health. Notably things such as building materials, volatile materials like glues and paints, Ventilation is important, furnishings, appliances, particularly unflued gas appliances, tobacco, smoke, cleaning agents, and the list goes on. The data from Australia, though, is limited, so we can't talk with great authority on this. It's quite, by comparison to international studies, it's quite limited. And furthermore, and sadly, in Australia, there's no specific guidelines for indoor air quality, and therefore no firm basis to form an assessment of the overall status. There are some studies, though. This Melbourne study here shows you the higher indoors, some of the problems with some of the pollutants indoors compared to outdoors. The State of the Environment reports are good resources for these sorts of studies as well. The effect of next to major roads, of course, has also been studied, and so you may like to look at that as well. Of course, there are natural phenomena, and we're going to be looking more at that. The picture on the left is a dust storm, and some of you will have experienced that. I certainly have. And the one on the right is an image of bushfires, and some of you will have experienced those. I have put additional articles on about hospital admissions from bushfires on LNS for you too. And of course, in 2016 there was an asthma storm, which we're going to talk about in your discussions. So natural phenomena are also a problem. Of course, as with many of these issues, particularly chronic diseases and so on, older people, people with pre-existing conditions, people in poor economies or poor housing, women, as I've said, and some occupations are more vulnerable. So that's it in a nutshell for air pollution. There's a good deal of reading for you to do, and there are many resources, not just under the air pollution tab, but also in the More to Explore tab. So I invite you to read judiciously, but I look forward to your discussions on this topic.